final aspect that we're going to talk about of the camera options is metering. Now, when we let the camera make a decision about their exposure, so we're in the semi-automated modes, be that aperture priority or shutter priority, the camera has to make a decision about what the correct exposure is. Now, the only way it can do that is by looking at the scene. And when it looks at the scene, and when it looks at that scene, it wants to find a middle point. And based on that middle point, it's going to choose the settings. It's going to automate the other two settings so that we get the correct exposure. Now, there's a number of ways that the camera can do this, and generally we want to choose the best one for the scene. So let's have a look at those. The first one is evaluative or matrix metering. So it measures light across the entire frame and considers the focus point. It's a smart mode. So it tries to balance exposure by looking at the highlights, the shadows, and where your subject is. It's great for sort of everyday use, portraits, product shots, and it's pretty reliable. Think of it as your camera doing an average of the whole scene with a bit more attention on the subject. What's doing is it's just making sure that it gets the best exposure to capture all the details of your subject. And the next one that we're going to look at is center-weighted metering. And this is where the camera samples a section in the center of the frame, and based on the lighting conditions in that particular point in the frame, it will decide what the most appropriate amount of light is to take in based on the lighting conditions of that point. Now, why is this useful? Well, this is always a helpful one when you yourself want to have a little bit more control over the metering. Now, what you can do is you can actually look at a particular point in the frame which you know that you want the camera to meter for, because to you that's the most important thing, and you can half press the shutter. Now that will make the camera make a decision about the exposure, and you can then return the camera to where you actually want to compose the image for and fully press the shutter. Now, this is quite technical, and it might be something that if it sounds appealing to you, you should read a little bit more into. But for most photographers starting out, it won't be super important. And then the final one is spot metering. Think of it like center metering, but with an even smaller focus. And further to that, you can actually move the spot around rather than it just being central. Then there's one fourth and final mode, and that's highlight priority. And what I just let you know here is that metering modes only matter when you're using an automated mode. They don't matter when you're using a manual mode, because you're the one that's metering the scene. You're the one that's making a decision about what you think the correct exposure should be. So if you let the camera choose, I, every single time, without fail, do the exact same thing, and I set it to highlight priority. The reason for this is if you have highlight priority, it will ensure that the camera will make the exposure such that the brightest point in the image is going to be exposed correctly for, and therefore when you edit it, you won't have lost any data there. And that way, other modes, you could potentially overexpose the brightest part of the image and therefore lose data. Me personally, I'm much more concerned about getting the data of those highlights than I am concerned about having noise in my image. So let's recap those last two. So white balance is making a decision about how much blue and yellow there is in an image and finding the middle point to ensure that those two things are balanced so that the image looks neither too blue or too yellow. And metering is the way in which a camera makes a decision about what it thinks the correct exposure for a given scene should be. And we can choose one of 4 different metering options to influence the way in which the camera makes that decision.